I'm just another has-been. I have been everything, and I'm glad to be out of it. But I do want to thank Tim for the invitation to be here this evening, and I thank all of y'all for allowing me to come and be a part of your camp meeting. We're going to be looking tonight at the escape and capture of President Jefferson Davis. Now, I'm going to say, I got to talk fast because Tim doesn't put me on a timeline, so you got to listen fast. But by the spring of 1865, it was pretty much a curtain that's about to fall on the Confederate States of America. General Robert E. Lee, I'm going to be walking around. Okay. General Robert E. Lee is here at Petersburg, Virginia. He has been there since June of 1864. Grant has tried and attempted on several occasions, 5 or 6 times, to break the defensive position of General Lee here at Petersburg. He was not successful. So what does he do? He does like he does in Vicksburg. He puts Petersburg under siege. By the spring campaign of 1865, Grant has cut off the 3 major supply lines for General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia going into Petersburg from Richmond, from down here in Wilmington, North Carolina, and from right here at Durham, North Carolina. The 3 railroads to supply General Lee have been cut off. On April the 1st, 1865, General Philip Sheridan overruns Confederate General George Dickey at a little place called Five Forks. The right side of his flank, the right flank of General Lee's army is collapsed. On April the 2nd, early in the morning of April the 2nd, General Lee sends Secretary of War Breckinridge word that his defense is beginning to crumble. If you remember right, you probably all heard the story of how on April the 2nd, which was a Sunday, President Davis was on his way to St. Paul's Episcopal Church. At approximately 8:40 that morning, he receives word from Secretary of War Breckinridge that the defensive line of Robert E. Lee has been broken. During the time that General Lee, Jefferson Davis is in St. Paul's Episcopal Church. I'll show you a picture of it. This was St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Y'all can pass that around. It was in this church that President Davis got the word from General Lee himself that it was time to evacuate the city of Richmond. The rest of that day until 11 o'clock that night, things were chaos and total confusion at the Capitol up here in Richmond. Warehouses were being burnt. The streets ran full of whiskey. Confederate soldiers, everybody was drinking whiskey out of the gutters running down the streets of Richmond, Virginia. That's how much confusion and chaos was taking place in Richmond. General Secretary of War Breckinridge was placed in charge of making sure that everybody that could would meet at the Richmond train station at 7 o'clock on the night of April the 2nd. They were to evacuate, and they would head toward the temporary seat of government, which would be down here at Danville. With all the confusion and trying to get everybody on the same page to catch the train. The train itself did not leave until 11 p.m. on April the 2nd. From the time they left Richmond, to the time they got here at Danville on the 3rd of April, it was 18 and a half hours on that train. The train itself could not make over 10 to 15 miles an hour. Now, imagine you've got the president, You've got the cabinet members, their families. You've got all the documents that they can take from the Capitol in Richmond. Everything is on this train. There's approximately 8 to 10 cars loaded down to the gig. People were hanging off the side of the cars. Everybody saw what was fixing to take place, that the Union forces on April the 3rd would come in and they would capture the city of Richmond. On April the 3rd, from the time, let me put it this way, from the time President Davis got to Danville until after General Lee surrendered on April the 9th, he never knew where General Lee was. Never heard another word from him. And then it was on April the 9th of 65 that he surrendered at Appomattox. But this whole train ride, he had no idea where General Robert E. Lee was. And it wasn't until he got to Danville, the Secretary of War informed him on the 13th of April that General Lee had actually surrendered. He did not receive the surrender papers, the official surrender papers, until the 19th from General Lee in a written surrender form. Like I say, I'm going to have to keep going here. They would arrive at Danville on the 3rd. They would stay until the 10th. Even Joe Johnson and PGT Beauregard were called to Danville after they set up the government there to fix the defenses around Danville. You remember, Sherman and Joe Johnson are fighting it out here in North Carolina. And PGT Beauregard was called to fix the defensive positions until they were able to escape again on the 10th of April. Now, we get down here to Greensboro. They cross the Virginia, North Carolina line. The train tracks from there until he is captured in Bowlinville, Georgia. There's no railway line. Everything he does from here to here to here is either on horseback, in an ambulance, or in a wagon train. Greensboro was not a welcoming sight for President Davis. In 1860 and 61, the county of Guilford, which is the county of Greensboro, the city of Greensboro is in, they were strong Unionists, and they did not go along with secession until the state in May of 1861 voted to secede from the Union. When President Davis is on his escape route, they did not welcome him in to Greensboro, North Carolina. For the simple reason that they were anti-secession, and as I said, Joe Johnson and William T. Sherman are in North Carolina. They were afraid, the people and citizens of Greensboro were afraid, if Sherman found out that the president of the Confederate States is in our town, he will come and do to Greensboro what he did to Atlanta, Georgia, on his march to the sea, destroy the town. As a matter of fact, when he first got off the train there in Greensboro, the first question they said he was asked, how long are you going to be here? That's how fast they wanted him to move and get out. They were scared he was going to bring the wrath of Sherman on. Not going to go into a lot of detail on the other route because Lexington, Salisbury, Concord, and when they arrived at Charlotte on the 19th, this is here at Charlotte, is where President Davis saw the actual surrender letter in writing of General Lee himself. And it was here at Charlotte, and the doors were wide open for the president, for his cabinet members, for everybody connected with the government. They even opened up the bank, the North Carolina something bank for him to stay in, for him to hold the government in. He was welcome. He leaves Concord, he goes to Fort Mill. And I was telling this to the group in Vicksburg the other night. I believe it was here at Fort Mill that the last cabinet member of the Confederate government failed. And if I can find it, I've got a picture of it. I'll excuse me. These are the cabinet members of President Davis's cabinet. He would call them, I believe, which would be the last cabinet of the complete cabinet. If you go on down through Fort Mill, Chester, York, Cokesbury, down to Abbeville, through this area right here, many of those cabinet members dropped off the train. They decided it was more important to their families in South Carolina, North Carolina, going on into Georgia. Their families became more important really than the government, because for all practical purposes, the government, you might say, was almost over with at Fort Mill for the simple reason there was no cabinet members. The last Council of War was here at Abbeville. And Abbeville would be the last of the last Council of War, when all the generals that were still in most of the generals that were still in the fighting mood or still had men to fight. This is pretty much where it ended, this last Council of War. I've got a picture of it somewhere. This is the house of the last Council of War. The generals were Nassau Dukes, William Breckinridge, Samuel W. Ferguson, John C. Vaughn, George DeBrill, Braxton Bragg, and Secretary of War John C. Breckinridge. At this meeting is where they tried to persuade President Davis that it was futile to go any further. They didn't have the men, they didn't have the material. Desertions, by the time they got to Abbeville, desertions from General Lee's army and a lot of the deserters from Joe Johnston's army of Tennessee, not enough to keep going. And on the 20th, 26th of April, Johnson, who was fighting here with Sherman, he surrendered Army of Tennessee. So you got the Army of Tennessee gone, you've got the great Army of Northern Virginia gone. Down the road, Nathan Bedford Forrest, he surrenders at Gainesville, Alabama. And so for all practical purposes, when he got to Abbeville, you might say the game was up. But President Davis, his wife would even tell him, and she told many people, Jefferson Davis could be very stubborn. When he felt that the cause that he was fighting for was right, he would go to the end of the world to fight for it. One of the things that President Davis learned at Abbeville was down here between Somerville and Dublin, Georgia. His wife, his family, the Burton Harrison, who was his personal secretary, they were traveling from here trying to get to Dublin. When President Davis found that out in Abbeville, he pretty much threw caution to the wind, because there were Union patrols hot on his trail from the time that he left up here, you might say, at Charlotte, North Carolina. He meets up with his family here in Dublin, and they travel to Irvinville, Georgia. On May the 10th of 1865, the Michigan 4th Cavalry and the Wisconsin 1st Cavalry overcame President Davis and his family about a mile north of Irvinville, Georgia. Show you some things here that if y'all all remember, they made a big mockery out of Jefferson Davis being dressed in a woman's clothing, trying to escape. The newspaper ate it up. Secretary of War Stanton, he was one of the main causes for so much of the untruth, you might say, about the capture of Jefferson Davis. The newspapers had a field day with it. This I had all these things in order at one time. Maybe I didn't. Sorry, folks. I had a picture of the wooded area just north of Irvinville where he was captured, and the tent that he was in. Hang on a minute. Give you, there it is. Knew I had it. But this is the wooded area just north of Irvinville, Georgia, where he was actually captured. As I tell you, the North had a field day with Jefferson Davis being dressed in women's clothing. This is just part of a cartoon that they had in the newspaper. They were much worse than this. They show him here trying to escape in hoop skirt, brandishing a knife. Hundreds of photos of him being dressed like that in the northern newspaper were everywhere. And this is a picture of the shawl when President Davis left the tent just before his capture. Mrs. Jefferson Davis threw this shawl over his head and his shoulders. If I can find it. This was the coat that he had on. President Davis was dressed in his gray uniform as usual. When he was awoken and was informed that the Union soldiers were upon him, his coat and Mrs. Davis's coat are identical. Only one was larger than the other. He grabbed Mrs. Davis's coat, threw it over his shoulders, put on his boots, left the tent, and she threw that shawl over his head because it was raining. Jefferson Davis at that time was not in good health. He was in bad shape physically. So this, as I said, that was the shawl she threw over his head. Now, what else do you see in that picture? I know somebody in the back can't see it. There's a set of spurs. When President Davis put his boots on and picked up the coat, threw it over his shoulders, she threw the shawl over his head and shoulders. The only thing that gave Jefferson Davis away were those spurs. When he left that too. Plaintiff claimed spurs as he was trying to escape. One of the young lieutenants of the 4th Cavalry heard the claim of the spurs. He halted President Davis, and that's when he was placed under arrest for, they said, for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which is not true. And they were going to try him for treason. That was not true. But that's what they had. The two things that they were eagerly trying to get across was that Davis had something to do with Lincoln's assassination, and they had to try him for treason.
It kind of sounds like now, don't it?
Yeah, a lot like right now. Okay, after he and his family are captured here in Irvinville, he goes here to Macon, Georgia. This is what the scene looked like in Macon, Georgia. President Davis is in that, he's in this ambulance right here. The family, he and his family are here. Some more of the officers, a couple of the cabinet members were in the wagon behind him. They carried him in to see General James Wilson. James Wilson was at the West Point Academy when President Davis was senator. They became very good friends. I guess you might say the one that treated him more humanly was the man, that general here at Macon. He kind of took him in, gave him rest, gave him food. But that was about the extent of it in Macon. He was then shipped. Wagon train here, took him 4 days from Macon to Atlanta, Georgia. See anything strange about this railroad that goes through Atlanta?
Looks like it's in good shape.
Good shape. All that time in the bow tie, railroad bow ties by Sherman, why was it that railroad left? And I have no idea. They took President Davis and his family to Augusta. From Augusta, he was put on a steamship named the Standish. They sailed down the Savannah River to the harbor of Savannah. There, he was put on the steamboat Clyde, he and his family. They were 4 days by ship all the way back up to Fort Monroe State, where President Davis had just left. Go into Fort Monroe, he would be there 720 days or 2 years. The whole time he was there, about the first 3 to 6 months, he was not allowed any visitors. He had no communication with his family. When he got off the steamboat Clyde here, they shipped Mrs. Davis and her family back to Savannah, and they were more or less what we would call the day house arrest. You don't leave Savannah without our permission, what they were saying. She had no contact with him. The second day he was there, he got there on the 22nd day of April. On the 23rd, he was placed in leg irons. Y'all remember that? General Nelson Miles was handpicked by U.S. Grant to guard Jefferson Davis. He was not a friendly man. He got orders from Secretary of War Stanton to put Jefferson Davis in leg irons. Why? Just because they had captured him. No other reason. They made a mockery out of him. They wanted the newspapers to know that they had the man that killed or had something to do with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and he is a treason in the United States of America. No other reason. He would stay in prison. After about 6 to 8 months, they kind of slacked up on letting him have visitors. His family came to visit him. She was even allowed to stay with him in a different cell than the one he was in to begin with. This is the pencil sketch y'all noticed, I like the pencil sketch. I got these back years ago. And supposedly they are from the original time, I guess you'd say. But this was a prison cell of President Davis. The cell itself was 18 feet by 17 feet. He was allowed one book, a table, a cot, and a pitcher of water. Excuse me. He would stay in that cell for almost a year before they allowed him and his family to, or Mrs. Davis anyhow, to join him at Fort Monroe. After 2 years, what I found was really interesting is the link that the U.S. government went to try and pin the assassination on President Davis. They searched and searched and searched. I was told at one time that they went through 16,000 documents that they had confiscated from the Confederate government just to try to prove that he had something to do with the assassination. And nothing ever came up. And they tried him, since they found they couldn't, tried for the conspiracy to kill Lincoln, or get him for treason. And they couldn't prove that. The one thing that they were most scared of was if President Davis ever got his day in court, he would prove to the U.S. government and to the world that they, the South, had the right to constitutionally secede from the Union, and they could not let that happen. After 2 years, he did have he did go to court, but he was released on a $100,000 bond by President Andrew Johnson, who took Lincoln's place. $100,000. There was no way that the U.S. government was going to put up that $100,000. They were not going to do it. People, the abolitionists, y'all remember a guy by the name of Derek Smith? He was in the Secret Six that had funded the John Brown raid. He and the editor of the New York Tribune, they put up the $100,000. But it made out like Andrew Johnson did. That's not right either. After he was released from prison, they could not prove anything on him. President Jefferson Davis went on about his life. He went to Canada, went to England, visited there, came back to the United States, and so y'all know, final story was where he ended up at Coldwater, the last home of President Davis. And when he died on December the 6th of 1889, this is what his funeral procession looked like on the streets of New York. There was over 200,000 people that came for his funeral. He was put in state 4 days here at the New Orleans City Hall. This is a picture of President Davis as he lay in state. If you look at this picture close, look at his mouth. Looks like he's almost smiling. It's kind of like I got the last laugh. He didn't give me for anything. After his funeral, he was buried at the Metairie Cemetery until 1893 when Mrs. Davis had his body exhumed, carried to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, the place where he should have been. I would like to see him buried in Mississippi.
Yeah.
He was a great senator, he was a Mexican war hero, Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce, one of the greatest admired statesmen, senator from Mississippi,
Cavalry leader.
cavalry leader. But Mrs. Davis had other plans, and she did return the body to Richmond. I'm almost through, Tim. I'm cutting it short and messing up. Has anybody ever seen this crown of thorns? Where did it come from? The Bible?
Bible. Crucifixion.
Crucifixion, the crown of thorns. The story is Pope Pius IX, the Catholic Pope, sent a picture and a crown of thorns to President Davis while he was in prison. Part of that's right. He did send Jefferson Davis a picture of himself. And inscribed on the bottom of that picture was what comes from Matthew 11:28. This was in Latin. And I did not put it in English, let me tell you that. Come unto me, all ye that are labored and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That was inscribed on the brass plate at the picture of the Pope. This crown of thorns was actually woven together by Mrs. Jefferson Davis. And she sent this crown of thorns to Davis when he was in prison. This crown of thorns and that picture were on display at the Confederate Museum in New Orleans in 1978, and was also brought to the last home of Jefferson Davis, Beauvoir, in 1979. And it says right here, this is the crown of thorns as a gift from Pope Paul IX, who had it woven himself. Incorrect. Not correct. And I'm going to finish with this. How many of you in here have heard of a pastor by the name of Dr. D. James Kennedy? I like the man. I think he was a good minister. I don't know who did the research for him. But in 1999, he did a sermon on the 4th of July entitled was Lincoln a Christian? There are several things in his sermon, it's a 6-page sermon. Several things in there that I don't agree with. And I'm really not sure, like I said, who did the research for him. Some of the research is wrong. And one thing that I want to point out is this. On April the 4th, U.S. Grant invited Abraham Lincoln to the Capitol in Richmond. It was surrendered on April the 3rd. He sends word to Lincoln, I'd like for you to come and visit the Confederate capital that is now in Union control. Lincoln goes, and he goes to the White House of the Confederacy. Executive Mansion of Jefferson Davis, sits down at his desk and looks out across the city of Richmond that has been totally destroyed. Now, according to Dr. Kennedy, I'm going to read exactly what he said in his sermon. I said it was his ability, talking about Lincoln, it was his ability to forgive anyone because he himself was so humble. Lincoln's humility further is seen when immediately after the war, he went to Richmond to the home the president of the Confederacy, who was, as you might imagine, not home. His wife came to the door, carrying a little baby in her arms. The baby was Jefferson Davis. The baby reached out to the president. Of course, Mrs. Davis was astonished to see Lincoln standing in her doorway. He took the baby into his arms and was given a big wet smack on the face. He handed the baby back to Mrs. Jefferson Davis and said, "Tell your husband with that kiss, I forgive him everything." Ladies and gentlemen, that never happened. Never happened. Abraham Lincoln never saw Marina Davis, and he certainly never held and kissed one of Jefferson Davis' children. It is a documented fact that on March the 31st of 1865, Mrs. Davis, her children, the little black boy Jim Limber, Burton Harrison, their escort, were safe in Charlotte, North Carolina. What gets me about this, like I say, I respect Dr. Kennedy, said a lot of great things. But can you imagine a pastor in a church of congregation of 1,500 on Sunday morning, millions watching by TV on Sunday morning? They hear this and they're ignorant of the truth. They're going to believe it's got to be the gospel because Dr. Kennedy said it. And look where we are today. It's the same thing today.
All brainwashing.
A lot of indoctrination of the school kids, whole 9 yards. Any questions?
Great job.
Thank you. Anybody got any questions? Now I'll turn it back over to you. Had to run through it.
Well, they were actually,
Next time, give me an hour.